Well, welcome everyone to our third webinar in this series. We're getting to the end of the course now. We'll have one more webinar in a couple of weeks' time. So in this particular module, module 3, the second module looking at enduring themes or concerns within Quaker testimony and witness, we've focused on some of the economic and ecological aspects of the early Quaker vision. It might be worth just reminding ourselves of what I'm trying to do here. I sometimes have to do that for my own benefit. The purpose is not to enforce the early Quaker vision on friends. I think my purpose in working with this material is to, first of all, allow us to understand where the roots of our common Quaker concerns, enduring Quaker concerns and Quaker practices, where they come from and what prompted them in the first place, by engaging with the early Quaker vision. And I think understanding that in itself has some value. But maybe more importantly, that then helps us to reflect, maybe with a fresh pair of eyes, on our current practice, our current understandings, and what this material means to us as friends today. So that's hopefully what we're doing together, and I'm hoping that you're benefiting from those opportunities, both in these sessions and in the conversations you may be having together. So as I said, what we'll do is we will just recap on the main points of the material for this module. I will respond to questions that I've received before the webinar. And in this particular case, I've produced written answers as well that will go into a bit more detail, and I'll circulate those at the end of the session along with the link to the recording. Then we'll have an opportunity for small group work. Now, I know some friends don't like that, so what I would offer you the opportunity is you can opt out of the breakout rooms if you don't want to go into them, and so you just don't accept the offer. And in that situation, if you maybe turn off your webcam and have some quiet time, if that's what you prefer to do. So, and then we'll have some general sharing and finish with some closing worship. So the normal format that we've used previously. So let's start then by, I'm going to share my screen because I've prepared some slides to go with this. Let's just touch on the key points of this module, and the questions that have emerged in the lead up to the webinar. So module 3, looking at what we can see in the early Quaker vision, and in this particular case, it's been primarily focused on the writings of James Naylor, one of the most important early Quaker leaders, probably the most competent theologian of the first generation. It's very interesting to see within his writings something of the radicalism of the English Civil War and Commonwealth period, which of course doesn't necessarily survive into the second generation, as we've seen, but also what seems to be common in the experience of this first generation is, in some senses, their spiritual experiences and their sense of rebirth, a new way of being human in a sense, seems to convince them that they're seeing things in a completely different way. And I suppose we might call that apocalyptic in its true meaning, which is things that were previously hidden or veiled are now revealed or unveiled. And one of the interesting things about the first generation is the way in which they feel they're seeing the whole of the creation in a very different way, and they're seeing their place within it very differently. So in terms of the economic dimensions, I've called it justice for humanity, but in terms of the ecological dimensions, I've called it justice for all creation. And I think actually in this particular module, these two themes are very much interconnected. Other things that we've done have maybe not fitted together quite so neatly, but I hope you've seen the very close interconnections between the economic and the ecological visions that we're looking at. So first of all, James Naylor's economic theology. I think it's fair to say that Naylor has a fairly radical vision. It's a vision that is common to the radical sects of the English Civil War period. I mean, my theory is that some of these ideas are actually very threatening to those in power, and it may be, one of the factors that leads to him being targeted as somebody who needs to be crushed by the parliamentary powers during the Commonwealth. So let's just review Naylor's top level arguments. And it's very much based on, we'll come on to this in the questions, quite a dualistic vision. There are essentially two ways, two choices that are presented to humanity. The one is the fallen way of humanity in Adam, and the way of the earthly powers, the ways of the world. And then there's this new possibility that's come about as a result of the incarnation, the Jesus event, of living in a new form of humanity, again, fully in the image of God. In Christ is the way early friends would have understood that, and the kingdom of God. And so time and time again in this, we'll see this is the way the world is because of humanity in the way of Adam, because of the way the world is corrupted in the fallen state. But this is what we found to be true, that there's a new possibility of living in a new humanity that lives in a very different way, and therefore of the coming of a new creation, a new kingdom, a new God's kingdom that will work along very different lines to the way the world has tended to work. And both in terms of the economic dimensions of all of this and the ecological ones, it's very much working within that quite stark choice, that quite stark dualistic choice that faces people. So first of all, Naylor argues that the world gone wrong, in a sense, is one characterized by greed and injustice. And indeed, humanity in the first birth, humanity in the form of in the form that's come about as a result of the fall, the broken relationship between humanity and God, is one that's characterized by pride and greed. So humanity wishes to gain wealth and power in order to have social status. Some people obviously are able to achieve that through all sorts of ways, but it's often a minority gaining wealth, gaining power, gaining social prestige at the expense of the majority. And so that leads on to this idea that when people are successful in amassing wealth and power, that gives them social status and means that they tend to require deference from those who they view as their social inferiors. And of course, Naylor argues that that's idolatrous because in a sense, we're all equally humble as creatures before God the Creator. And anyone who raises themselves above their brother and sister and requires acts of deference from them is in a sense demanding worship from them. And of course, from Naylor's point of view, that's idolatry. That's worshipping the creature rather than the Creator. And Naylor, throughout his whole Quaker ministry and his writing between 1653 and his death in 1660, consistently does two things in terms of how he's addressing this issue. He warns the rich and the powerful about the consequences of the way they behave, about the injustices of the way they behave, and that that's not God's way. And so there's prophetic warnings to those in power. But at the same time, in the style of the Hebrew prophets, Naylor's also making pleas to those in power on behalf of the poor and the oppressed. And so this is a voice which we might say is very much in the mold of the Hebrew prophets, condemning injustice, condemning greed, warning those in power and pleading for the cause of the poor and the oppressed in the context of a world gone wrong. But obviously, the very thing that generates the Quaker movement and gives it its power is this experience of a new possibility, a new way of being human, fully in the image of God, that convinces them that they're living through the final culmination, the transformation of all things, the coming of the new creation, the coming of the kingdom of heaven on earth, and so on. But their experience of that new humanity is very much associated with the Jesus event. So the new life in Christ, rather than being characterized by pride and greed, is characterized by humility, generosity, a commitment to justice. And so those people who are living in this new possibility, which of course for early friends they felt, this new way of being human is what's coming for the whole of the creation. It's the old ways are dying and the new ways coming. And in this new way, when you participate in this new way of being human, you will live like the example of Christ and the apostles that they read within the New Testament. And of course, we know that Christ and the apostles lived a life of voluntary poverty, of sharing together. In particular, of course, we've got the section in Acts of the Apostles where after the Holy Spirit's poured out, the church, in a sense, sells its possessions, gives things to the poor, and shares all things in common. And so there's an assumption that when you're living in that new way, your life will reflect that willingness to share, willingness to be generous, commitment to humility and community. And in thinking about this, we did make the connections to other radical religious groups. It's this kind of idea is common amongst the radical religious groups of the late medieval period, the radical wing of the Reformation, and into Puritan England in the 17th century. And so we saw in the presentation some examples of that in the Anabaptist movement and in radical Puritanism. For example, Gerard Winstanley, the digger leader who was active in digging in the late 1640s and subsequently became a Quaker later in life. But we also noted that time and time again with all of these themes, something is viewed fundamentally differently, and the Quaker movement is fundamentally at odds with the world, in conflict with the world in many ways, because they feel the world is dying and this new way is coming. But when it doesn't come, when those hopes are, in a sense, disappointed, when the monarchy is restored in England in 1660 and Quakers start suffering severe persecution and have a fight for survival, this more radical kind of message begins to wane. Quakers are less inclined to give warnings to those in power, are less inclined to promote what is often accused of being levelling principles. And indeed, we saw the way in which Robert Barclay, in his apology, specifically says, we are not levelers. We don't want to disrupt the natural relationships between master and servant and all the rest of it. And we accept that God has given some people more than others. So we move from a situation in which Naylor is saying inequality, poverty, some people with great wealth, the oppression and the injustice that goes with that is directly a result of sinfulness and fallenness and the world gone wrong. And then within 20 years, we have the primary defender of Quaker principles arguing that God ordains those inequalities. And so there's a really significant change that happens in a relatively short period of time. Just before when I first opened my computer up and I was on Facebook, I came across something that's this really interesting because it roots these ideas right back to the early church. So this is St. Ambrose of Milan in the 4th century. Nature has poured forth all things for all people for common use. God has ordered all things to be produced so that there should be food in common to all and that the earth should be a common possession for all. nature, therefore, has produced a common right for all, but greed has made it a right for a few. So we can kind of see these radical ideas that we see in Gerard Winstanley, we see in the Levelers and the Diggers, we see in James Naylor, reflected in the words of the early church fathers at a time just before the church is transformed into an organ of the state, in a sense, when Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. And it's no surprise that ideas like those communicated by Ambrose are less significant during the long period of Christendom. So that's just a connection right back to the very earliest times that I thought you might find interesting. So if we move on to the ecological dimensions of Naylor's theology, again, what we see is this fundamental distinction between the way the world has gone wrong, the way humanity is in that first birth, and what is coming is this new possibility in Christ, this new kingdom that's coming. And so Naylor argues that humans were created to bear the image of God within creation and to reveal divine love and wisdom within it. However, when humans turned away from that direct inward guidance of the divine spirit, that loss of relationship with God led to a dysfunctional relationship with the rest of the creation. So like the economics, what's produced a destructive and dysfunctional relationship with the creation is the world gone wrong, is the fallenness of things. But of course, again, the hope is, and this is what early friends are experiencing, that that's now been, in a sense, the solution has come to that problem. The incarnation, the Jesus event, has established a new way of being human, fully in the image of God again, revealed again in that idea of generosity and justice and compassion and so on. And that in a sense, heals the dysfunctional relationship between humanity and the rest of the creation. So when the fall creates the dysfunctional relationship, the reconciliation and the healing of the human will that comes in this new possibility restores right relationship with the rest of the creation for those who are living in that new possibility. And in that new humanity, in Christ, humans can again be a vessel through which divine love and wisdom is poured upon the rest of the creation. That's something I think actually that is very strong in Naylor's writings, but you can also trace it back to the early church and the patristic writings. And it also features within the Eastern Orthodox spirituality as well. So that's the essence of what we've done. Maybe not as quick as I should have done, but it gives you a bit of an overview and a bit of a reminder of where we've got to. I'm just going to walk through a few of the questions that we've had over the last few days. And they're very interesting. And Alistair in particular, Alistair Reid, has really given me some challenges to work with here. So we'll walk through those. And the questions I'm going to suggest we think about come out of these responses. So rather than having a massive list of questions from the two sections, I'll try and boil it down to something a bit more manageable this time. So the first one that was received from Alistair Reid was, our understanding of the economy has changed significantly over time since Early Friends. How useful is this binary approach of the apocalyptic vision versus the way the world is in developing a way forward for us today? And that's a really good question. It's very easy for me to get carried away with being inspired by Early Friends and not think about the practicalities. I mean, I think if it's certainly true that Early Friends, and James Naylor in particular, did not develop an economic theory or a political strategy. So they didn't have a clear end result that they wanted to achieve. And the reason for that was they felt this was God's work and God was doing it in their time. And what they said about economic and ecological issues was not about demanding anything in particular, but more reflecting on what they felt God was doing in their time. So it's understandable that we might say there are limitations to using this early vision in any kind of practical way within our lives today. Having said that, I do think that as a model, the basic distinction between a way of being human and a way of being society that is corrupted and in Adam based on greed and pride, the desire to amass wealth, and that producing inequality and injustice and a dysfunctional relationship with the creation, set against a different way of being human, which is based on humility and sharing and compassion and right relationship, as models, I think, still have relevance in how we might judge what we're led to do in our own personal lives, but also it might help us judge what we see to be appropriate ways of managing economic matters, appropriate ways of managing political and social matters. What I would agree with is that the very simple, stark choice between one or the other doesn't seem realistic to us today. We probably all accept that there's a mixture of Adam and Christ within us, two ways in a sense. The key question is, in our own personal lives, which one's dominant? And in our economic structures and so on, because of course, this becomes solidified in bigger structures, economic structures, political structures, and ideologies and so on. When we're looking at those, which of these two ways is dominant within those ways of organizing the world? And that prompts questions for us, I think, about how social and economic and political change happens. And so in a very simple sense, you know, there's been a big debate across history about whether it's structural and material changes that transform human society, or whether it's the transformation of human ideas and consciousness that drives material changes, you know, and that's often been a division within the way people have seen things. And maybe it's better to understand that as a sort of a dynamic interconnecting, that the two kind of work maybe in different ways at different times, but both of those factors are at play. It's very clear, though, that early friends felt that it was a transformation in the individual human and their very will and motivation that would lead to the transformation of all things. Now, of course, we might take a view that that was somewhat naive, but that's certainly where they were coming from. And of course, it's at the heart of our faith that transformation comes from us listening to the inward teacher, listening to inward guidance. And so it's still an important part of our spirituality today. I mean, when we look at our current dominant global economic system, if we say, is Adam most visible in it, or is Christ most visible in it? I mean, first of all, we might say that it's a system that's predicated on perpetually stimulating our needs and desire for things. And so if fallenness and corruption is about humans, in a sense, in bondage to the desire to want and own and control things, our very economic system is functioning in order to stimulate that and encourage it. And so it's hard to see, in a sense, how a commitment to generosity and sharing and a right relationship with the creation is possible when you have an economic system that's working to encourage people to plunder the resources, to gather wealth, to constantly want more and more things so that more and more things can be sold. And so that's something I think we need to grapple with. And of course, overall, how do we, in very practical ways, at all sorts of levels of our lives, foster what early friends would, I think, call the generosity of Christ and tame the greed of Adam? If we accept that greed and pride and desire for wealth and social status is a fundamentally dangerous kind of dynamic within human society, but that generosity and humility and sharing and so on is something to be encouraged, how do we as friends work with that, both in terms of our own personal choices, but also in terms of our engagement with how the world works? So I think what I would say to Alistair there is, yes, there are absolute limitations, but I think the essence of the issue, of the problem, is well reflected in that basic distinction between two ways of being human, two ways of organizing things. Both of them may be within us, but which one is dominant? Alistair also asks a very specific question about what James Naylor meant in one of the slides in the presentation when he said, laying house to house and land to land till there be no place for the poor. I think what Naylor's saying there is that the greed and the desire to amass wealth leads some people to grab and control it for their own personal benefit. And that's inevitably at the expense and well-being of other people. And so if a small number of people end up owning and controlling everything, the mass of people own very little or nothing. And if you own very little or nothing, it's very hard for you to be able to make a living, make an independent livelihood. And therefore you become dependent upon those smaller number of people who've got all the wealth and all the power. So that's what I think Nail is saying, is laying house to house and land to land means people amassing wealth and so on, and that squeezes the poor out. The poor have got nothing left to base their own lives on. I think that's what Naylor's trying to get at there. And then I think this is the final one from Alistair. Again, an important challenge. Naylor's views are pre-Darwinian. We're looking a bit more at the ecological side now. But the world, obviously, in our modern scientific understanding and in our understanding of evolution, has constantly been changing. Species have been changing, some dying out, some changing over time and so on. And of course, today, very few people would understand the Garden of Eden as a literal thing that actually existed. And so there's the question that I think a useful challenge that Alistair's giving us. What relevance are these kind of pre-scientific visions of the world to us today? And again, I would accept that early friends are pre-Enlightenment people. They're operating within a traditional biblical worldview. But at the same time, we need to say, does their vision help us to better understand the current situation we find ourselves in as primarily a spiritual crisis rather than simply a technological matter? So is there something deep, something wrong, deep in the very heart of the human will and the human motivation that's causing all of these things? And of course, our tradition remains, it doesn't matter how pessimistic we feel about things, there's a sense of hope in that possibility of transformation, in that possibility of finding a place of guidance within ourselves and being brought to a place of right relationship with God, with each other, and with the rest of the creation. And so again, I think there's something for us to grasp hold of there, despite all of the fundamental changes. There's a chasm between early friends and us, but they were identifying things that I think still remain relevant to us today. And actually, when you look at what early friends write about created things, about the physical world, is they specifically say an absolutely essential characteristic of the created physical world is that it's forever changing. I mean, one of the reasons they say you should focus on God rather than created things is that God doesn't change and God is eternal, whereas physical and created things are always changing. They're corrupting and dying and being born again and changing over time. So I think although they're science, Enlightenment and so on, they obviously aren't in the place where Darwin was. They do recognize that the created order, the physical world, is a constantly changing thing. They think it's a good thing. It's not that it's a bad thing, but they think the best way to live within the world is to live through the perspective of the very source of its creation and the very ordering principle which they understood as God. And that's why it's important to focus on God rather than created things. That's what brings you into right relationship. I think it's also fair to say that if you look at that passage by George Fox on being brought back into the paradise of God and the creation being open to him, it's very clear to me that Fox is not saying that he felt he was back in the Garden of Eden as it was written about in Genesis. That's not what he's saying. I think what he's saying is, um, I I was brought back into union with God, into relationship with God. And in that place, I had a new vision of all things. I could perceive things differently. And so I think, it doesn't matter how pre-modern Fox and early friends were, they're not using the biblical narratives always in a very literalistic sense. And so the paradise of God or the Garden of Eden is much more understood as a metaphor for being in union with God, being in right relationship with God, being ruled by the very source of all things and the very ordering principle of all things. A really important thing about the early Quaker vision when it comes to ecology and economics is that for the previous 600 years or more, Christendom, the binding together of the church and the state, had argued that the way the world is, in its very hierarchical ordering and so on, is the way God ordained it to be. And so actually that left no space for change. The power structure of the church and the state said, the way the world is the way God's ordained it to be. And of course, then our focus becomes much more on what happens when we die. But the Quaker vision and the radicals of the time are saying, no, the way the world is actually a consequence of the fall. And when we go back into right relationship with God, things will be transformed, will be made better. Injustices will be put right. Hierarchies will be relativized. We're lifted into unity and diversity. And so I think that's really important because that opens the possibility of change and an expectation of change and a recognition of the fact that the way things are now is not the way God intended them to be. And I think also there's this idea of an opportunity to consider again the true character of God and humanity and the nature of the kingdom and what that means. And of course, a vision of the world put right has been a significant motivator for Quakers throughout history. I was wrong, there is one more from Alistair. So the final point linked to the previous one is that Alistair was talking about, given that we live in a very different place, given that our way of being human now is fundamentally changed by science and all the rest of it, how can we be the vessels of God's love and wisdom on earth? And again, what I would say is that I think it's reasonably easy to translate what early friends are saying into a way that makes sense today. So the first thing I would say is that the character or the nature of the God that people worship essentially determines their lives. We either make the God that we make God to look like us, or we end up becoming the God that we worship. So that's the first thing I would say. And so humans living in the way of greed, hard-heartedness, oppression, and destructiveness are actually a curse on the rest of the creation. When humans live in that way, they are actually damaging to the rest of the creation. Whereas if humans live in the way of generosity and love and compassion and wholeness, they become a blessing on the rest of the creation because of the way that they live and the way that they function as part of that wider creation. And so one of the ways of understanding that idea, which maybe seemed to be archaic, that we talked about, of being a vessel of God's love within the creation, is simply recognizing that when humans are transformed and the image of God is restored within them and they live in that way of generosity, love and compassion and so on, they're a blessing to the creation rather than a curse. And that doesn't wipe away the changes of our scientific understanding, because this is more about values, it's more about a way of being, it's more about relationship than it is about factual things about the physical world. And I think that that ethical way of being, relationship to everything else, is the key issue here. And I think hopefully we can still see some meaning in the early vision in those terms. Mary Woodward flagged up a key point, I think. She was reflecting on looking at how things had changed and Quaker involvement in business and the Industrial Revolution and so on. And this idea that she suspected that the situation was more complicated than we realise. I mean, we sometimes whitewash the past and only believe the nice stories of Quakerism. And of course, Quakers have got things wrong. They've been on the wrong side of history at various times. And so there's, across Quaker history, like any other group, there will be examples of integrity and philanthropy, but there'll also be examples of where friends were inevitably caught up with the corrupted and unjust ways of the world. And I think that prompts an interesting set of questions for us. The big one, in a sense, is the extent to which we can live in the world, a world that may be gone wrong, whose values aren't the ones that we find validated in our inward spiritual experiences. How can we live in that world without being taken over by it, without being a part of it? Is it possible to live consistently by values that are very different from the dominant ones in the culture around us? Now, Quakers have taken different approaches to that over history. They've never been quite like the Anabaptists, who attempted to live differently by completely separating themselves. So in a sense, today, the Amish are maybe the most obvious example of trying to live differently by as radically separating yourself as possible. Quakers never did that. They were wary of the corruptions of the world, but they were willing to work within it, whilst trying to maintain their distinctive values. But I think that's a very tough thing to do. And, we see Quakers with good intentions still getting themselves caught up with the corruptions of the world. Indeed, we might argue that they're unavoidable. If you live within a society structured along in unjust principles, it's very hard to separate yourself from that, because you benefit from it simply by operating within that particular context. And certainly Quaker business, as Mary was indicating, found itself, major businesses like the Cadburys and so on, inevitably they couldn't get cocoa other than getting it from places that were implicated in the slave trade. And so that's an example of the way in which operating within the world really sort of draws you into the injustices and corruptions of the world, whether you like it or not. And it's very, very hard. It's one of the big dilemmas I think we have when we think about Quaker testimony. How do we live consistently based on the values that we found to be true in the leadings of the Spirit when we're operating in a world that works on very different principles? And how different are we actually? My ex-colleague, Martin Layton, I remember, I don't know whether these are his words or whether he got them from somewhere else, but I remember him saying, if I was brought before a court charged with being a Quaker, would there be sufficient evidence to convict me? And that kind of, it's a tough question for all of us. Is the way I'm living really, really reflecting something different? Or am I really kind of going along with the way things are, with a bit of token resistance here or there? And that really also reminded me of Advices and Queries number 38. Do not let the desire to be sociable or the fear of seeming peculiar determine your decisions. So this is all about how do we live with integrity based on what we really deep within us feel is the right thing to do, particularly when that makes us look peculiar, particularly when it gets us into conflict with the wider society. Because most of us, I think, feel that we want to fit in and have a life that's bearable, and sometimes living by rigid principles, by consistency of principles, is very difficult. And I think that issue that Mary's raised, I think, is a key issue for all testimony. How far are we prepared to go in being steadfast in our commitment to what we found to be true within ourselves when it's at odds with the way the world works? Rhiannon Jehu, I don't know, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, raised some interesting questions. She noticed the connection really with the 8 foundations of a true social order that London Yearly Meeting agreed immediately after the First World War, and I included a couple of those foundations in the presentation on economics. And she also talked about the current concern about building back better as being maybe a couple of examples of how Quakers have responded to these sorts of situations in the world. She's noted actually there's a bit of an issue around Build Back Better because certainly build is sometimes associated with the way European societies have always built on the backs of the oppression of other people. And better, of course, is controversial because what is better? And so we're back into those dilemmas about what's right, what's ethical, what does the spirit require of us, what does love require of us. So I think all I'm noting there is that these are good reflections. They're things that allow us to explore how this has become relevant at the early parts of the 20th century and how it's relevant to us today in terms of how we're responding to the very particular circumstances we find ourselves in. So these are good examples of how Quakers have responded to a world gone wrong. And sometimes in our history, corporately, we've been quite comfortable with the status quo and the establishment. You know, we like our good reputation and our respectability and so on. But then at other times in history, Quakers have found themselves called to refuse and disrupt business as usual and to try and live holy experiments, new ways of living. Those are the words of Rachel Muirs, if you remember, from her work on Quaker testimony. So where are our leadings taking us today? And Mary Jane Kamel just reflected on the fact that she could see real connections between what early friends were saying about economics and the environment to our current situation within the world today. And so again, another thing for us to focus on. And it's maybe not coincidental that early Quakers emerge in a time of great suffering and social turmoil, fundamental social and political change, because there does seem to be a strong correlation between periods of upheaval and new ideas, new movements of the spirit, new possibilities emerging out of the breakdown of the way things were. And so we might ask ourselves, might we be seeing in our current emerging crisis, economic and ecological, new ways of thinking, new ways of living? I think I might have mentioned this in a previous webinar, I can never remember, but I sometimes see those earlier movements of the spirit, which of course often died out or at least calmed down a bit like the Quaker movement, as the Braxton Hicks within history, those sort of testing contractions that happen in a pregnancy, and that they're just the test, but the full labour and the full birth of the new world, in a sense, is yet to come. And hopefully that's an optimistic thing to kind of focus on. So we're coming to the end of this now. I've talked a bit too much, as I usually do, but I've got these questions and I'll put them in the text box when I stop sharing in a moment. That come out of some of those reflections. And so maybe, hopefully, there are a more limited number of questions for us to cope with. So despite the limitations of the early Quaker vision, what might it have to teach us today, particularly in the areas of ecology and economics? How might we encourage the generosity of Christ and tame the greed of Adam, both within ourselves, but also within our communities and within our political and economic systems? To what extent is it possible for us to live within the world without simply becoming part of it? Can we steadfastly and consistently live in a different way? Going back to that difficult challenge. What refusals and disruptions and holy experiments do we think are emerging today for us? And how might our current circumstances, the current global crisis in a sense, prompts fundamentally new ways of being human, fundamentally new ways of organising society? And what place have Quakers got in exploring those things? So that's, I hope you're all still alive. I'm sorry, I've gone on a bit there, but what I'm gonna do now then is post those, give me a second, I'm gonna post those questions in the chat area. And invite you to maybe break. Let me see. I can't multitask. You see, I'm trying to do something and speak at the same time. It doesn't work very well. Maybe just have a little bit of time together in smaller groups, and then we'll finish off with with about 20 minutes or so for a general sharing. So how many are in the room now? We've got 18 in the room now. If you'd rather not join a group and you'd rather just have a bit of quiet time for yourself, don't accept the offer of the room. Turn off your webcam and just have a bit of quiet time together. But those of you who'd like to have a bit of an opportunity to talk in a smaller group, we'll have 10 minutes now. So it's 10 to 8 now. So we'll have up till 8 o'clock, and then we'll have a very quick comfort break before we move into general sharing. So I'm just going to put you into groups. So how many have we got? We've got 18. Maybe. Okay, so just an opportunity then, friends, to use those questions and have a little bit of a sharing in the group before we come back into whole group sharing. So I'm going to start the rooms now. So over to you. So welcome back, friends, and over to you, really. I've talked too much as always, but if there's anything anyone wants to bring to the table, more challenge, or we've got something from Duncan there. So Duncan says, Ambrose considered the poor not a distinct group of outsiders, but a part of the united solidary people. I think this all links to othering people and planet. That's a great reflection. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed about the early Quaker vision is the sense that in this new life, there's a certain unity that transcends the outward divisions of the world, but it's not a unity of sameness. It's a unity of diversity. And so actually, when you have a unity of diversity, there is no other. And actually, that reminded me of the conversation that I had with Marilyn last time about dualism and non-dualism. I think in one sense, the deeper truth of how things really are is non-dualistic, but in some senses, it's the very corruption that creates the dualism in a way, because without the greed and the evil and so on, all that's left is good, so it's working with those sorts of things. But I think certainly at a deeper level, our delusion, in a sense, is our inability to see the unity of things, and that the other is not other at all, but actually another organ within the body. To use Paul's metaphor, the body is made up of many parts, and all of those parts need to be there, and they need to work together. And if one's in one's suffering, then we all suffer. And I think that's a nice metaphor for it as well. So thank you for that, Duncan.
There's another bit to it here, which is it's all on Wikipedia, but that actually giving to the poor is not considered to be an act of generosity towards some fringe of society, but is a repayment because you happen to be given it in trust at some point by someone, and that you're repaying resources rather than being nice and generous.
So it's more like a reparation in that sense, maybe a reparation for an injustice, or a
circular economy. To use modern terms, a circular economy. It's just like, I happen to have some resources, so obviously I've got to redistribute them.
Yeah.
And I have a responsibility to redistribute them as best as I can. It's like if you've got a really nice wool jumper and you no longer need it, you give it into the charity shop so it can be remade into something else.
And that again links there's a very interesting connection there with the sort of radical Reformation ideas. So one of the things about the Anabaptist tradition was that some of the groups had a shared purse approach to living together, where everything was shared in common. And that was groups like the Hutterites. But the Mennonites took the view that you sit very lightly on your personal possessions, and if somebody has greater need for them than you do, then they should be theirs. And that's slightly different, but you can see some continuity of approach in all of this. So I don't know whether this is Mary or Alistair, but we ended up considering practical ways of encouraging Christ's generosity and taming Adam's greed. And on a parallel with the Iona community's approach, we wondered about setting up local groups of mutual accountability about our compromises with the world. That's really interesting. It's the kind of thing that I think is a great idea, and I never get around to doing. I always run away from those things. But I think actually that's a practice that's really become quite common within American Quakerism, the idea that you have groups of mutual accountability and support. Because, you know, I know personally, I can admit that I'm not living up to the standards, but I can very easily escape from facing up to that. And it's harder to do that when we're each holding each other to account in a loving way. And I think that's a really, really interesting and helpful thing to consider. Lynn, did you want to speak?
Not Quakers, but what you're saying resonates quite a lot with African culture and African philosophy. The one that's predominant in Southern and Eastern Africa is Ubuntu, which is basically can be crystallized into the belief that an injury to one is an injury to all. So you have a duty to everything and everyone around you. And then interestingly, the issue of theft is also a very interesting one there. Not that everything is owned communally, but for example, if I have 2 pairs of trousers and I only need one and you don't have any at all and you take my trousers, well, you haven't stolen them because I wasn't using them anyway and you need them. So it's not communal ownership, and it's not that everything's owned communally, but you only use and have you're only entitled to what you need. Anything more than that should be shared with everyone else.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lynn. It's a very different way of looking at things from the dominant Western model, isn't it? Sorry, it says Gareth, and I don't know whether it is Gareth, but would you like to speak? Sorry, you're muted. I can do it. There we go.
Yeah. Yes, sorry, what you were saying about mutual accountability reminded me of something that was going around a while ago. I don't know whether they still exist. You know, groups setting themselves up to encourage each other to set carbon targets and sort of reporting back, you know, sort of counting their carbon footprint at the beginning of the session, and then, you know, coming back at regular intervals to share how they had managed to, you know, to cut their carbon consumption, which I thought was, you know, was interesting in terms of, you know, the environment and what we could do about that.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's sort of overcoming our hyper individualism and finding communal solutions is one of those themes that's coming up, isn't it? Henry's helpfully posted a link that will give us more information of the context of the Ambrose quote. If anybody's interested in that, you might want to capture that. Sarah Martin has written, I'm interested in Friends' response to question 3 and related to what extent can we live in the world without simply becoming part of it? For me, this was greatly helped by entering membership in my mid-20s and entering a mini society based on moral principles that I trusted to give me a better steer in the direction I would like to take my life. Are our methods of discernment robust to take us safely through the 21st century with continued integrity? Thank you, Sarah. I mean, I think we're getting a bit of a theme here, aren't we? You know, one of the things that's dysfunctional about how we function is that we believe somehow we're autonomous and that we can function as individuals, whereas at a deeper level, actually, we're not separate and we're not disconnected. We're interconnected, and we have a shared kind of we have a shared experience because of that, even if we find it hard to face up to, and finding communal solutions. But they have to be, you see, one of the reasons that we find community difficult is that community can often be authoritarian. And liberal Quakers, we run a mile from being told what to do. So it has to be mutual, doesn't it? It has to be based on, as far as possible, equal power relations, genuine a voluntary basis, no coercion, a clarity about us doing it in love for mutual support. It's those sorts of things that I think are important, because you could very easily get groups where one or two people tell everybody off for not living the standards that they think they ought to. And so how we manage those things are quite difficult. But I think that these sorts of ideas that are coming up are quite countercultural. They're the sorts of holy experiments that we mentioned before that are well worth exploring. Henry said, "Didst thou submit?" Yeah, thank you.
I think what you just were saying, Stuart, is actually a very powerful point. And it is.
Henry, your voice is coming through very faint. Can you move closer to the mic?
I'll try again.
That's better.
This also connects to the last sentence of what Sarah said, that I do worry about our ability to hold on to the power of the meeting for worship for church affairs, because we're not doing very well at acknowledging the need to submit these days. I regularly find that I find it very hard to even say to people, you do understand that you're bound by decisions of yearly meeting in session. As a member of the Religious Society of Friends Britain, you've accepted that yearly meeting in session can make decisions for you. Come on, somebody nod.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think what you've highlighted is a dilemma for liberal Quakerism in particular. Culturally, we want to be permissive. We want to be open to, lots of people say, well, what I find helpful about Friends is that nobody will tell me what to do. And that's a little bit at odds with what you've just talked about, which is surrendering ourselves and submitting to the discipline and the sense of corporate leading. And so I think what you've highlighted is a really interesting cultural dilemma or conflict that's specifically for liberal Quakers, because of the tension between our culture of permissiveness and individualism and our discipline of surrendering and as you put it, submitting. And I think well, just the fact that you've raised it and we talk about it is helpful, because as you've indicated, it's often just not talked about.
I think we talked about that, but we also talked about how it's actually quite arbitrary, and that because Friends have a commitment against gambling, then I'm advised that I shouldn't buy a raffle ticket or that I shouldn't hold a raffle at a Quaker event, but nobody's telling me I shouldn't own a car. And which is the greater sin against the environment, against other people in the world? I know which I think is. So yes, there's a corporate discipline, and yes, we should respect it, but we also have our own consciences to be our guide.
And I guess that idea of forming mutual accountability kind of groups is a nice kind of localized way of getting beyond some of the limitations of all of that, if we're willing to submit ourselves and so on, and do it in the right kind of way. Duncan talks about submitting our tax returns. I mean, there's interesting issues about how how much integrity and truthfulness is in my life. What is my do I project a particular image of myself and hide lots of things about myself? Am I consistent in the way that I live within the Quaker community as I do in other bits of our lives? And of course, that's another example of the way modern fragmented society creates multiple personalities, because we tend to adapt ourselves to the dominant culture of the different environments we operate within. So we might have one persona in our work environment, we might have a quite different one within our Quaker community, and a different one again maybe within our family. And so that raises all sorts of interesting questions about integrity and consistency. And so on, and those aren't individual flaws. They're cultural issues, aren't they? They're something we're caught up in. And so the other thing we need to recognise is that however much we strive to be people of integrity and high kind of ethical standards and so on, we also can't be pure, because we live in a situation in which we're implicated in things, whether we like them or not. You know, so what does it mean to be a pacifist sheltering under the largest military power system that the world's known? You know, what does it mean to be committed to economic justice when we're beneficiaries of a global economic system that's fundamentally unjust, and we tend to be the beneficiaries of it, you know, depending on our personal circumstances. But those are structural things that it's impossible to completely sort of free yourself from. Yeah, this is all really interesting, friends, and tough and challenging stuff, but really helpful. Sorry, Alistair Reid, did you want to speak? You're muted.
Yeah, sorry, the latest version of Zoom makes it more difficult to do that. I was interested that in the kind of the second or third generation of friends, the elders regularly came around to visit Quakers who were families. And they then discussed with them how they were living up to the light in terms of their personal integrity, their business, and all this sort of stuff. And because they were families, it was a kind of a group discussion. Now, there's clearly different levels of authority, but I remember many years ago, I suggested setting up and meeting a small group of people, somewhat along Iona community principles, but they perhaps go further than I would be prepared to do. But it's simple things like I was at Woodbrook once, and there were some people who were staying at Woodbrook who were, I think, clearly not Quakers, but they said, well, we're from Orange Street in California, and we were glad that we only pay little taxes. So I was, well, being an argumentative sort, I immediately countered saying, well, the whole point about paying taxes is for this, this, and this, etc. And it's interesting to me that when I go to Sweden, the attitude towards taxes, it's changing slightly, but it's completely different. It's a bit like the attitude towards voting. You vote, you pay taxes, there's no quibble about it. And in a way, we moved away from that. And it's like, I feel the need when I go in other social circumstances to actually defend higher taxes, defend more egalitarian spending and things like that. So you actually have to be forthright in coming forward to defend what might be a more egalitarian situation, which doesn't mean to say I'm going to be becoming a Marxist again. I mean, I was one for 5 years and that was enough. But I think we need to refresh our own memories as to what the whole point of an egalitarian society could look like and ways that we could move towards it.
Yeah, thank you, Alistair. I mean, these things do get rather complicated, don't they? I mean, I'm very comfortable at a nice high level of generality and principle, but when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it, the real practical stuff, it always gets complicated. And you know, when it comes to tax, of course, Quakers are conflicted on this, because on the one hand, as you've just said, it's important that we all share based on what we can afford for some kind of common provision, but so much of our taxes are used for very negative things as well. And of course, there's a long tradition of withholding tax when the money's being used for military purposes. And so it just gets complicated, doesn't it? But I take your point about being an advocate for a society based on generosity and sharing rather than on individual interest. I think that's absolutely true. Duncan says, tell us more about why Berkeley ended up apologising, saying we're not levelers. What was wrong with being radical? Great question. I mean, there's I mean, what seems to happen is that
Stuart, I don't know whether I heard it right, because I probably haven't followed all the detail of the materials properly, but you seem to imply that it was like an apology within Quakerism for something like correcting us, taking us away from being banded with other levelers.
Sorry, the word apology is the name of the piece. It's essentially a defense of Quaker understanding. So the Apology for the True Christian Divinity was the book. But it's written in the second generation. So Naylor's writing in the periods 1653 to 1660. Berkeley is writing his Apology for the True Christian Divinity, by which he means Quakers, in the late 1670s. And so what basically happens is that the first generation of Quakers are a product of Civil War, well, radical Puritanism and Civil War radicalism. And so that mix of levelers and diggers and all of those groups at the time who were disaffected by the Commonwealth because they felt that it hadn't gone far enough in reforming society and democratizing it and leveling it and so on. Quakers are very much part of that culture. But when the Commonwealth falls and the monarchy is restored and Quakers, along with all the other dissenting groups, are seriously persecuted, Quakers have to find a way of surviving within the society as it is rather than the way they were hoping it would be. And one of the things that they do is they begin to control very strongly any message that might seem to be threatening to those in power at the time. And so we get a move towards a much quieter, tolerate us, we won't cause any trouble. In some ways the peace testimony is in 1660 is a product of telling the powers of the day that leave us alone because we won't cause any trouble. And so there's very much a dynamic like that going on. And so by the time you get to Berkeley, and of course Berkeley and William Penn are both people from aristocratic backgrounds, both of them friends of the person who was to become James II, with access to the court, of a higher social order, and in defending the Quaker position, they feel the need to deny being levelers and go as far as, in Berkeley's case in the Apology, in accepting that social divisions are ordained by God. And so it's very much about that transition from being a radical movement of the Commonwealth to being a quiet and non-threatening peculiar people trying to survive under serious persecution and argue for religious toleration. Those are some of the dynamics that are going on at the time. And the reason for that.
Tell us, where has Margaret fell in that? Because obviously around that time Margaret was befriending King Charles as he came back or whatever, riding on a horse and greeting him at the seaside or whatever. But she was obviously holding the men in a certain way through all of this period. And I'd be interested, given she's, not aristocracy, but she's middle class, she's a woman of numbers and a good businesswoman. What was her thinking around that? Because I can't imagine it was Berkeley, but I can't imagine it was Naylor.
No, I mean, she's interesting because, of course, she's also a first generation friend, but she's one of the few people, along with Fox, who survives the turmoil of the 60s and lives on long enough to order the movement and to see it stabilized for the future. And I think if I'm honest, I've spent quite a lot of time studying Fell and running courses on Fell. She's an amazing woman. In the 1650s, she was confined to Swarthmore Hall because she was effectively running the estate there while her husband was traveling around doing his work as a judge and so on. And she was the centre of the HQ and so on, and a great manager of things. She managed all the communications and so on. But her husband, Judge Fell, died in 1658, and that effectively freed her because her daughters were old enough to begin to run the estate at Swarthmore Hall. That freed her to become a political lobbyist in London. And because she was a member of the gentry, she had access to the court. She could use her social profile in order to politically lobby on behalf of Quakers who were in prison. But of course, even that begins to move in a more, what you might call, conservative direction. And so, in many ways, the marriage of Margaret Fell and George Fox is the great kind of institutionally symbolic kind of solidification of the movement. And in the 70s and 80s, of course, they're very much involved with establishing order, managing the way the movement is perceived. We get the setting up of the second day morning meeting, which is a group of male elders who have to scrutinise anything that's going to be written in the name of Friends to make sure it's suitable before it's allowed to go into publication. And so we get this very fast transformation between quite a radical and fluid movement in the 1650s to a relatively authoritarianly ordered movement managing its public image and trying to convince the authorities that it's not a threat to them in that second generation. And Fell is absolutely a key player in all of that. Yeah. It's often said that Fox is the orderer, but I think Margaret Fell was the one with the great skill in that.
Oh, for sure. No, she's the systemic person. So she thinks systemically, but it's what she was thinking underneath that makes me interested in whether she would be with Berkeley thinking that inequality is fine, sorry, but that's what I think he says, or whether she would be with Naylor saying, no, it's not.
I would say she's closer to Berkeley than Naylor personally.
Okay.
There's an indication that in the very early days, Naylor was quite critical of people like Margaret Fell for continuing to dress in their finery, in a sense. And, Naylor's very much the ascetic, voluntary poverty, itinerant minister. This is the way God's people live. And he's concerned about wealth as a corrupting thing. And so some of that stuff's going on, I think. And Fell is a transition character, but I think she's closer socially and politically to the Berkeley position than she is to the Naylor. And of course, it's no consequence, setting aside all the factors that led to Naylor's conviction of blasphemy and so on, that he's the one that the authorities choose to crush. And I think in a sense, his politics and his economics were too radical.
But was he a scapegoat?
Oh, definitely, definitely. That's a whole extra story. If you want to do a course on Naylor, I'm running one in the middle of September through to the middle of October. But certainly Naylor seems to be a good example of somebody who won't last very long because their witness is so threatening to the social order that somebody has to get rid of them, basically, and that seems to be what happens to Naylor. Obviously he makes it easy for them because he does something that allows them to haul him off to Parliament and try him and all the rest of it. But yeah, it's an interesting story, that transition. There's a few people are fading away now, and we've gone over slightly. Henry says Penn wrote a pamphlet defending Quakers as Trinitarians against the accusation that they were Unitarians. Well, that whole issue about whether Quakers were Trinitarian or not is an interesting one. Early Friends were very clear that that complicated doctrines were just a way of talking about religion rather than actually experiencing and living it. And so they tended to be against doctrine. But if you look at early Quaker writing, they constantly use Trinitarian language. They're very comfortable with Father, Son, and Spirit in practical terms. And Penn being a second generation person, it's relevant because toleration was only granted to Trinitarians in the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And so that was a crucial issue.
Yeah, that's the only reason I mentioned it, because it fit in. Sorry, say again. That's the only reason I mentioned it, because it fit in with this notion of going along to get along.
Yeah. Finding a way to accommodate to the world so that the world will accommodate to you. I think that's a big issue that's going on. And I kind of don't blame that second generation for doing it, because they probably didn't have any choice, but something is lost in the process. So I think we need to round off. Thank you, friends. It's been really interesting to receive some of that stuff. This is challenging material, but let's just finish with a few moments of worship, friends.